In this next section, we're going to look at some of the social and political issues surrounding film and kind of the uproar film actually has brought to the United States for most of its history. From early on, Americans began to realize that motion pictures could have a pretty powerful impact on the United States. If I were to ask you which film people were most concerned about, I'm sure you would say D.W. Griffith's A Birth of a Nation. We talked about how that brought about such protests from the African American community for its sent positive portrayals of racism. But that was just the first indication that the film really could influence politics and social life. So there was an uproar over control of the medium. People wanted to sort of keep this entertainment machine in a box. So many types of moral guardians came forward. Church officials, ministers, social workers, police, politicians, women's groups, they all began to agitate in various ways for a way to control this new enemy of civilization. A number of attempts were made throughout film's history to censor it, and the first actually was in Chicago in 1907. Films were required to have a permit from the superintendent of police in order to be able to show them. These early attempts at censorship came to a peak in 1915 with the Supreme Court decision that denied the film industry constitutional guarantees of freedom of speech in the press. In other words, it wasn't considered to be a serious medium. It certainly was by no means an expression of art, and it was considered actually to be no more than a carnival sideshow or a vaudeville show. But really what happened was that the ruling legitimated prior restraint, allowing any government agency to evaluate a movie before it could be seen in public. So in 1921, over 100 anti-movie bills were introduced in state legislatures, and there were significant attempts at national censorship. And of course, the industry was determined to fight all of those attempts. So I want you to see that there was so much concern about the impact of film. Parents were concerned about the impact of their kids going and staying, sitting in an afternoon in a dark movie theater. The chief of police in New York City declared motion picture theater houses to be menaces. They were fire traps and menaces to life. And so New York City actually closed down all of their movie theaters for a period of time. So people were worried about the social consequences. They were worried about the physical consequences. And the worry was so heavy that there actually was a series of studies undertaken at the University of Chicago called the Pain Fund Studies that looked at a number of different dimensions about how people learn from films. Were teenagers learning to kiss from watching Efren Zimbalist and Mary Pickford on the screen? So, these concerns about media effects go a long way back. And of course, we will talk about that a lot more when we talk about film and radio and the other more contemporary media. The industry has had to deal with challenges throughout its history besides censorship. One came from the threat of war between 1939 and 1942 as the U.S. began moving toward war and then, of course, went to war in 1941. Hollywood began to depict the joys and glamour of military life. Producers could have access to military equipment for any film that might serve as a recruiting poster or simply as publicity for the armed services. At first, the war's films dealt with training rather than combat, and the military was sort of a romantic background for, love stories and things like that. This is not in the text, but some of the most interesting films that have been made were made by the War Department in conjunction with Hollywood by a director named Frank Capra. You may know the film It's a Wonderful Life. That was Frank Capra. But he was employed by the War Department for 1942 to create a series of films called Why We Fight, to convince new recruits that they should go off and, be willing to hate and kill the enemy. So that was a purposeful effort of the government and the film industry for propaganda. But even without that sort of purposeful intention, once America entered the war, German and Japanese people became the stock villains. The war years generally were pretty good to the motion picture industry, even though production dropped, but employment was up, so people had money to spend, and Hollywood, on the other hand, it was just coming out of some pretty desolate times from the Depression in the 1930s. But just as it was getting on its feet, a few major challenges occurred. The first set of challenges came through the courts. In the 1930s and 1940s, as you will recall, Hollywood controlled the entire system. They controlled production, distribution, and exhibition. In other words, they owned the studios, they owned the means of distributing the canisters with films, and they actually owned their own theaters. And you'll recall that I said that the studios were sued in violation of antitrust laws in 1938. Well, before the war, the government refrained from prosecution if the studios promised to settle disputes fairly among themselves. And of course, between 1938 and 1948, when the final, 1947, when the final Paramount decision came down, the country was at war, so nobody was really paying a whole lot of attention to the legal problems of the industry. Nonetheless, they didn't get along, and so the Paramount decision in 1947 restricted the practice of vertical control, forcing studios to sell their theaters. So this changed the production of film. It leveled the playing field a bit for independent film, but it also made it so that studios had to cut their low-budget movies because they couldn't get enough bookings in the open market competition. So they used only big-name movies and big-name actors. So there was a huge change in the content. Now, a lot of the movies that were not being made would have been B movies anyway, but whenever you see the cutback on creativity, I'm always concerned. Another major challenge came from the House Un-American Activities Committee. This is a period that you may know of as the Red Scare, and the entertainment industry was the target. So at first, the motion picture industry sort of thought, Senator McCarthy and the House committee were kind of crazy and they weren't too worried about it, but it became clear that they were on a witch hunt. And so when HUAC cited movies like Mission to Moscow and A Song of Russia that were made when we were a Soviet Union ally, when they started saying those are evidence that Hollywood is communist, those people in Hollywood began to get worried. And so it was a system of blackballing individual directors and individual actors. Careers were damaged, reputations were ruined. Some people never made it, never recovered from this time. So it changed the content of Hollywood movies as Hollywood tried to convince Americans that it was not a refuge for subversives and that they weren't all communists. So the industry actually had to start doing propaganda for itself to counter the accusations that were coming from Congress. We'll talk when we get to the television unit about Edward R. Murrow as the one who challenged Senator McCarthy and brought this, the Red Scare to an end. Probably the biggest challenge for the whole industry was the challenge from television. In 1939, when NBC started its daily broadcast, there were only 1 million television sets in operation. A decade later, there were 50 million sets. So movie attendance was absolutely decimated. At first, the motion picture industry tried to ignore it. They wouldn't advertise on television. They forbade their actors and writers and directors to work for any television production. But soon they realized that the wind was changing and the audiences were in fact leaving film to go to television. They wanted to stay home and be entertained. So again, it was the most progressive and forward-thinking studios that said, if you can't beat them, join them. So Warner Brothers quickly took up television, became one of the industry's most prolific producers of TV programming. The film industry also tried to counter TV by offering full color movies. Again, these big, spectacular things, widescreens, stereophonic pictures. They even had smell-o-vision and 3D. Okay, so they tried all kinds of things to make going to a movie as popular as staying home to see a movie. Uh, they also shifted to family films because, again, families wanted to stay home and watch TV. And they were also interested in marketing films to youth. In the 1960s, they began to see movie spectacles again, like The Towering Inferno and Jaws and Star Wars. Of course, right in the middle of a Star Wars remake right now. We'll see if they redo Towering Inferno and Jaws. I would be surprised if they didn't. The economic challenges continue also as the industry became bought up by huge media conglomerates. Some of these companies were not even weren't even identified as media companies. They owned other things. So, for example, Matsushita is not a media company, but in 1962 it bought Universal. General Electric bought Paramount Studios at some point. So, 20th Century Fox changed hands twice and is now owned by News Corp and Rupert Murdoch. So although these changes are occurring over a period of decades, the trend is one toward limited number of independent studios and the major studios being owned by corporations that have a lot of interest other than film. There's a list here that, I'm not going to ask you to know who bought what when, but I want you to see the tremendous changes that occurred in ownership. And of course, the issue with ownership is that if you have people who are accountants and lawyers, not artists and filmmakers making decisions, you're going to see a whole different quality of film. So costs kept filmmakers from gambling on untried formulas. They have gone with the logic of safety. We don't want to take any risk. And so since the 1960s and certainly in the 1990s and 2000s, we've seen a huge increase in sequels and remakes, and it has and is continuing to accelerate. So this ends our discussion of film. We will move on next to our discussion of radio.